Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Taylor Clem, and I am the Environmental and Community Horticulture Agent and Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator in Alachua County at the University of Florida IFAS Extension. I'll be presenting today on water conservation for homeowners, or the basic water conservation for homeowners, as part of your Master Gardener Volunteer Training course. So already you've probably learned a little bit about the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program and its 9 principles. So what we want to do today is just, or as part of this module, is dive a little bit deeper into some water conservation aspects that can be interesting for us to know, because then it can help prepare us to share that information for some other homeowners or some other community members as we go forward as volunteers. So after today's program, or after this module, there's 3 different objectives that we should be able to address, or that we've been able to cover. So by the time that we're done, you should be able to discuss concepts of watersheds. Second, you should be able to utilize water conservation techniques, or have that ability and knowledge to be able to utilize those water conservation techniques. And lastly, be able or feel comfortable to recommend basic water management and conservation techniques to others. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's talk about our water supply. Where does our water supply come from? So it does come from the rain. So as part of our rain cycle, we have we have evaporation from the water bodies, and then condensation, which forms into the precipitation that we get of rain. And that rain, that's so important for us, because that rain, it helps recharge our aquifer, as well as it helps provide moisture for our landscapes, our agriculture, wetlands, streams, creeks. So our water supply comes from rain. So it's important to know about, just even though it's in a cycle, it's just also how is that water supplying our landscapes. So if we're talking about recharging our aquifer, it's important to know that we need areas where water, or that rain, can infiltrate and percolate through the soil to help recharge our aquifers. So as we start doing more development within the landscape, those impervious surfaces increase stormwater runoff, which could decrease the amount of water that can enter our aquifer to help recharge it. But it's always important to know that our water is going in a cyclical cycle as part of that rain cycle. So a lot of it is being provided to us through rain. But one of the biggest things that we always like to talk about are watersheds. We all live in a watershed. We're all connected to water in some capacity or another. The best way to think about a watershed is, it's a big funnel. All the water that lands in different areas around the landscape, based off of the topography and how the geology of the environment is set up, the water will funnel to certain points. And those certain points, or that big region, that geographic region where that water all funnels to, is considered a watershed. So a great example is the Mississippi River is a giant watershed that has all those different rivers and streams that feed into it. But there's sub-watersheds all filled within that. But it's important to know that no matter where you're living, you live within a watershed. And anything that you do within your landscape or your environment impacts something downstream, whether you are directly impacting a water bottle or a water body, or indirectly impacting a landscape or a water source through like stormwater runoff or pollutants infiltrating through the soil, etc. So, but let's talk about a little bit about the 5 functions of watersheds and why they are so important. So first off, they help collect rainwater. They help funnel it to certain locations. Second one is they store water at different amounts for varying times. Third is they can help they have that release of runoff water. They have diverse sites for chemical reactions, as well as they create unique flora and fauna habitats. So it's important to always know that we live in a watershed, and all land area is part of a watershed from varying different scales or differing scales. So it's important to know that moving forward, what our impacts are, and that our water flows downhill somewhere and has something that can impact. So in Florida, we kind of have 2 different seasons. We have our wet season and our dry season. So 70% of our rainfall comes during the summer, or our wet season, and that helps replenish surface water as well as underground aquifers. But it's also important to know that our highest demands are during the dry winter in the spring. So that's where we're using a lot of that water is when we're not getting the recharge at that time because it is during that dry period. So a lot of that use is related to tourism, seasonal residents that come in and out of Florida, as well as agriculture. So Sunshine State or Water State. It's important to always know like how much water that we get here in Florida. Florida is a Sunshine State. New Mexico is also considered the Sunshine State, but we get way more water than New Mexico does. But it's important to always think about how does that impact, or that amount of water, how does that impact us environmentally, ecologically, as well as how do we manage ourselves as a state, making sure that we're using that water appropriately. So one of the neat things is Florida has on average about 56 inches of rain per year. That is a lot, but almost 45 inches of that is lost to evaporation and transpiration. So the amount that we're actually using or being able to use within our system, that goes into the aquifer to our systems is actually significantly reduced. But we also have big drought periods that can occur. So during 2006, that was a big drought year, and we only had about 40 3/4 inches of rain throughout the year, almost an entire foot below normal. And that has a huge impact, especially if we're looking already, what is that total loss due to evaporation and transpiration? So drought can have a significant impact on the state. So rainfall cycle typically goes within a 10-year cycles of droughts and floods. So we've been looking at something like the early 1970s, 1980s, 89, 90, as well as the late 90s. That was another big drought year. I actually remember when I first moved to Florida, it was in the middle of a drought year, and I saw a lot of the lakes and streams significantly drop just because of the severe lack of rain that was helping recharge those superficial water bodies. But also some of the impacts that can occur that can affect our water is population, water demand associated with population. So in 2007, the state of Florida, the total population was almost 19 million people. But we know that population is going to gradually increase and grow. We actually do know that between 2005 and 2060, the population is expected to double. So by 2030, the population is going to be up almost 26.5 million. But by the time we get to 2050, we're going to almost be to 36 million, 37 million people within the state. That's a lot of people. So that's going to have a significant impact on water use throughout the state. So that's why we start to think about water conservation. So let's look at some of those water demands. So with increased use or more people moving into the state, we know there's going to be increased use. So looking at some of the data and the numbers that we do have, in 2005, Floridians used about 6.5 billion gallons of water per day. That is a lot of water, and about 43% of that was used for agriculture, whereas 37% was used for public use. But flash forward, based off of projections in 2025, we're expected our demand is going to increase to 8.5 billion gallons per day. But one of the unique things about that is, yes, it's about a 2 billion gallons per day increase, but that agriculture number is actually decreasing to 35%, and that public use is growing to 49%. And one of the biggest reasons that is happening is as our population is growing, there's more development. And prime developable land is agricultural spaces. So we're losing agricultural land at the same time. So that is one reason that can contribute to why agriculture use is decreasing while public use is decreasing over that period. So this starts to give us some reasons to conserve. We need to conserve our water throughout the state, and there's multiple reasons, and the list is almost endless. But it's important to think about water conservation and the fact that we need to preserve water as much as possible, or conserve water as much as possible to meet the future water needs of the state, as well as the economics. You know, the infrastructure required to maintain a fresh water supply for the public is incredibly expensive. So if we start putting too much stress on our existing infrastructure, that requires upgrades to our systems, pipes need to get larger, pumps need to be larger, or entire new water treatment facilities need to be built, or wastewater treatment facilities need to be built. And that's incredibly expensive. And that's just from the public side. From the homeowner's perspective, you know, water conservation is a wonderful way that can help us save money at home, as well as making sure that we are putting less water in our landscape. So there are economic benefits for doing these practices at our house. But also it's important that it helps, knowing that it helps preserve the environment or helps protect the environment. You know, our environment, all of Florida's ecosystems were built and evolved around water. If we start changing that, that can have significant impacts on our environments and our ecosystems. Just because we have a lot of water in the state does not mean that we can use much more of it, because there is still a balance that's happening within the environment with our water, the amount of water that's present. But also, one of the nice things is it saves on energy. So we're talking about as demands increase, there's also a lot of energy required to clean water, to help treat water, both for fresh water or wastewater treatment. So if we have the ability to conserve water, that can help save a lot of energy consumption, especially we're looking at non-renewable sources that we use to generate some of our energy, like our natural gases and oils and coal, etc. So it's really important when we talk about water restrictions or reasons to conserve, you know, already across the state, there are multiple different water restrictions that exist. So this is talked about in the Flora-Friendly Landscaping Module, but it's important to always know that you need to look at different municipalities or counties or water management districts to see if there's any water restrictions that exist. So this example that you have on the slide, this is specifically with Alachua County, but it comes from St. Johns River Water Management District as well. So it's based off of the time of year and based off of growth. So we have different summer watering restrictions and winter watering restrictions. And that's just based off of our annual average rainfall expectations of what our water demand and water use is going to be. But there are some situations where we could be in periods of high drought where there's additional water restrictions applied for irrigation or just general around the house water use. So when we start talking about landscapes and ways to conserve water, you know, obviously the Florida-Friendly Landscaping Program wants to help conserve water as well as protect water quality. So we talk about water-wise landscaping, which can be part of the Flora-Friendly Landscaping Program, because it's kind of a design mechanism or design strategy to really think about how we're using water in the landscape. When we talk about water-wise landscaping, you know, I'm going to talk about different strategies that you can use, but it's important to know the process and how you can start to create these landscapes that are using water as efficiently as possible. So talking about the planning and design of water-wise landscapes, it's important to identify growing conditions. What vegetation is already existing within the landscape? How will the property be used? What is the function? Check for city and county restrictions, because that's going to have a significant impact on how you plan and use a landscape, as well as if you live in a homeowner association, they may have specific requirements or landscape code or restrictions on how you have to plant those landscapes. So this is very similar, or this is almost the same exact thing as the Flora-Friendly Landscaping Program's Right Plant, Right Place. How are you going to plan and design a landscape really depends on what are those environmental conditions that you're planting, the function of that landscape, as well as what are some additional rules and restrictions that can determine what types of plants that could be included within your landscape. But one of the other important things to know is when we're trying to plant a water-wise landscape is know your soil. Knowing your soil is one of the foundations to starting a successful landscape. You know, soil comes in so many different types of classifications, drainage classes, etc. So if you know your soil or you learn about the soil, it allows you to, it creates essentially a good foundation for a successful landscape. So get it tested. As Master Gardener volunteers or as extension agents, one of the first things we typically try to point homeowners to is getting their soil tested. As part of soil tests, you can get pH test as well as nutrient information. Because what that's going to do is that allows us to You know, are there soil adjustments that we can do to the pH to make it more appropriate for certain plant material? Or what are some of the nutrient deficiencies within our soil that we need to supplement with fertilizers? Secondly, with the soil, learning about the soil, is the drainage. Drainage is very important. Some plants prefer poorly drained soils, while others really need well-drained soils. So knowing that drainage classification, or knowing how well your soils drains, can really help you make sure that you're finding plant material, selecting plant material that you can use so they can be successful in the landscape and require less inputs. So when choosing proper plants for a water-wise landscape or a sorter-friendly landscape, think about how much of the existing landscape you can keep as possible. So I know there's multiple times where development can come in and do clear cuts. It's not preferred to do that at all. But if you can look at what's the existing landscape, use that. Use trees, some of the shrubs that already exist, but keep as much of the existing vegetation as possible because those plants are already happy, healthy, and established. But choose plants that can survive on normal rainfall for that area once established. That's going to be a really important one. And that really comes down to that right plant, right place again. Is those plants that grow well and thrive in those conditions, you can put them in that landscape, and once they're established, they don't need much supplemental irrigation, if any at all, except during periods of bad drought. But you know, following that principle, right plant, right place, so many plants can do successful in the landscape. It's just making sure that you match them to those environmental conditions that they prefer to live in, or so they can thrive. And it can also be encouraged that when you're doing water-wise irrigation, to plant natives when possible. Not always is it possible, but it could be a good preferential compared to non-native species. So moving forward with choosing proper plants, then we can start to talk about, you know, that specific plant material. So how big does a plant get? Where can you put that in your landscape based off of its size? What are the sun and shade conditions that it really likes? Its soil needs, its water needs, any types of tolerances that it has. So knowing the plant material is going to be important to make sure that it is successful in the landscape, so then you can plant it in the right spot. So when we put landscapes, or we kind of design and plan where we're going to put different plant material throughout the landscape, we want to think about how those plants that have similar needs, we want to put those together. We want to put them together based off of their water needs. So plants that have high water needs, we need to group them together and plants with low water needs, we need to put them together, because what we can do is we can have a landscape that you can have your high water area. If it needs to be irrigated, you can specifically irrigate that area a little extra, versus areas that does not need much water, and say during times of drought, it's very drought tolerant, you might not need to irrigate that much. So you can kind of really control how those plants, that amount of water that is going to be used in the landscape when it is necessary. So there's one thing we like to mention, it's called the zone of fence. So these are like different areas of the landscape that we can, or different ways that we can design the landscape, different typologies, to kind of create different interests. So some of those are the natural zone. We have a drought tolerant zone as well as an oasis zone. So we'll talk a little bit about each one. So the first one, the natural landscape. So the natural landscape is exactly how it sounds. It is what's that existing landscape that's occurring around the landscape that you're designing and planning. Can you kind of bring them together? Can you meld them together? So if you live next to a oak hammock, a hardwood hammock, what you have the ability to do is pull some of that plant material. Think about what are those plants that are existing within that natural area and bring them into your landscape. Or maybe same thing if you live in a pine flatwoods. You know, what are some of those plant materials you can think about bringing them into that landscape? So select plants that are best for the area's temperature and rainfall. So that can be a really good indicator. What are the plants that are growing around that landscape you're planting at that moment? That could be a good indicator of plants that can do well in that site. But usually when we're talking about natural landscapes, we want to lean towards those native species. Usually they're going to be those native species because we're trying to recreate that natural habitat. So we want to make sure that we are not only having proper plant selection, we're also providing additional wildlife and habitat structure that could naturally exist. But the natural landscape is a departure from traditional landscape, but it's only a departure from traditional landscape, you know, in a minor capacity, but at the same time, there's a high demand and a lot of people are wanting more natural landscapes. The second are oasis landscaping. So oasis landscaping are showy plants that are placed in areas with the most visual impact, like entranceways and courtyards. Usually these are the landscapes that we want to attract people's eye, that kind of pop with color or some type of texture that allow people, that direct their vision and what they're looking at. You can also kind of move them through spaces around the landscape. Typically they're higher maintenance, not always, and may require more water. Whereas the natural landscaping, those areas are less visible, and but we're going to typically put those on the sides of building. In those transition zones, those are plants that require less water than the oasis, but are more water than the natural area, kind of the in-between spaces. So next, I want to talk a little about turf and water conservation. So sometimes there's the thought that turf grass requires just too much water or so much water, but that's typically a misnomer. Turf grass does require supplemental irrigation during periods of drought, just like all of our other plants do. But if we have the ability to, if we actually manage turf grass appropriately, then you can have a much healthier turf grass that requires significantly less inputs and makes it incredibly drought tolerant and helps significantly conserve water within the landscape. So first off, always follow UF fertilizer guidelines for low to moderate maintenance. Some of our recommendations have a range from low to high maintenance, but the high maintenance isn't necessary for homeowners. So we could typically work or apply fertilizers based off of low to those moderate ranges of maintenance requirements or fertilizer requirements. And that is enough to provide a strong, healthy, aesthetically pleasing turf grass, and has incredibly low, significant to no fertilizer loss associated with leaching. So also when you're mowing turf grass, let grass clippings fall. As they break down, they'll help provide additional nutrients to the turf grass, making them more successful and stronger within the landscape. As well as it's important to mow at proper heights. Mowing at the proper heights can help create successful root growth, and that root growth creates a healthier turf stand. Also, make sure that you keep mower blades sharp. The sharp mower blades help create cleaner cuts on the turf grass, which reduces the stress to the turf grass stand immediately after mowing. And also, consider other different types of plants or feature where just grass is not suited. It's not the right plant for the right place. What are the alternatives that you can put in that landscape that you can plant that better fit those environmental conditions? So regarding irrigation, so to irrigate efficiently for our landscapes, it's important to separate irrigation zones for turf and flat beds. We don't want them on the same zones. Primarily building code and county codes throughout the state requires micro irrigation for our plant beds, and we can have rotor beds or pop-up rotors for our turf grass areas. This is done specifically to reduce the amount of water we use within the landscape. So separate those irrigation zones based off of turf and landscape shrubs. Use a rain gauge. How much rain have we received recently? Because we typically recommend just turn your irrigation system off once the plants are established and only turn them on during periods of drought. And a rain gauge is a great way we can see how much rain we recently got, so that we can kind of determine if it's worth turning that system on or not. So another recommendation is only water when needed during those those periods of drought. So there's some ways that we can look at and determine if our plants are dry. And especially within the turf grass, we can really see it. So the blades start to fold up and they turn like a bluish gray, bluish green color. And as you walk around, you can actually see your footprints in the grass because it's just not rebounding very quickly. Those are just some visual signs that you can tell that it's time to irrigate a turf grass. Or you can kind of just dig around in the soil and see if the soil is really dry or not. But that's a great way as an indicator, so we can kind of say, okay, the turf grass does not need it versus it does need it, and then only turn on your system if your plants need any type of supplemental irrigation. We also recommend watering early in the day. Watering early in the day, make sure that you are using the water efficiently, as well as any excess moisture that might be on the plants. Rather than staying throughout the night and potentially causing fungus, what it does is as the day starts to warm up, that water evaporates and it helps keep the plant blades dry. As well as to irrigate efficiently, make sure you sweep sidewalks instead of hosing them down, just to make sure we're conserving water. Other ways to make sure that you're following water scheduling. Going back to the watering restrictions, consider your county water restrictions. What are your restrictions for the area? Some counties even have water restrictions, but they do not pertain to wells. But it's very important that just because you have a well and you don't need by law to follow those water restrictions, it's still important to follow those water restrictions because there's a setup and a way to conserve water within our landscapes, but as well as having those reducing or irrigating effectively can help actually produce or create a happier, healthier, stronger landscape. So also make sure that you check, does that scheduling change throughout the year? In Alachua County, we have our warm season and our cool season irrigation, and all changes based off of the time change. So during the warmer times of the year, we have the ability to irrigate twice a week. And in the cooler times of the year, we have the ability to irrigate just once a week. And that's primarily based off of the active growing season, because during that winter period, our plants aren't actively growing, so there's not really much of a need to irrigate them much. But during that active growing season, that's when we're going to be using more of those resources and requiring some type of some moisture or rain to help them grow. So it's important to know that if it's raining, you're not necessarily going to have your irrigation system on. Use your irrigation system as a supplement to the rain. So if the rain is providing enough irrigation, or if the rain is providing enough water for your landscape, irrigation is not going to be needed. Additionally, for our controllers, we also have some different rain shutoff devices, soil moisture sensors, weather-based controllers that can help override our system for us. So it may seem like it's dry outside, but our sensors might have readings on them that say there's actually plenty of moisture in the soil, or it's rained recently, or it's going to be raining in the next 48 hours. That would turn your entire system off for you, just to help you have peace of mind that you do have some type of controller or override device that can turn your system on and off for you if you don't have the ability to do it manually. Another great way to conserve water within the landscape is through mulching. Mulching is a great way to conserve soil moisture. It can help add nutrients to the soil. It can help protect against soil erosion. It can reduce weed growth, and as well as it can provide habitat for beneficial soil organisms, as well as an improved landscape appearance through different aesthetics. So mulch, it's one of the points of the principles of the Florida Landscaping Program, but it's a significant tool that we can use in our landscapes, that when we're mulching appropriately, which is a 2 to 3 inch depth, that we can get all these benefits, which can include conserving water. Also, we want to make sure that we perform proper maintenance for our landscapes. Manage weeds that will compete with plants for water. Replace plants that are poor performers. Check sprinklers frequently for efficient and application to areas with plant material. Follow turf practices that don't encourage thatch development. So those turf practices are fertilizing appropriately, mowing properly, irrigating responsibly. So follow those best management practices to reduce thatch development, or that discourage or don't encourage thatch development. Lastly, follow the basic levels of fertilizer applications, so not to encourage excessive growth. You can if you apply too much fertilizer, it leads to excessive growth, which can lead to higher needs for water, or it can increase pest pressure within a landscape. So lastly, I'd just like to do a review. So we started off the program, we talked about the concepts of watershed and how our systems, our aquifers are all recharged with rain. So next we talked about how we utilize water conservation techniques, kind of like those oasis, natural landscapings, as well as that transition zone between those two. And then lastly, we talked about recommended basic water. We want you to feel comfortable to be able to recommend basic water management and conservation techniques to others. So thank you for joining us on this module today as we discuss basic water conservation for the landscape.